Get your black ass out of here before I call the cops, boy! Dale Morrison slams his truck door and storms toward the well-dressed black man, jabbing his finger aggressively at his face. The man Judge. Theodore Washington instinctively steps back as Morrison towers over him, beer breath hot against his cheek. You think that fancy suit fools anybody? I see what you are. Morrison shoves Theo's shoulder hard. Probably got warrants. Probably got drugs in that stolen car. Theo's hands remain steady at his sides, even as Morrison circles him like a predator. Sir, I'm just trying to use the restroom. Don't sir me, criminal. Morrison kicks dirt at Theo's polished shoes. Crawl back to whatever ghetto you came from. What neither man knows is that tomorrow morning they'll meet again under very different circumstances. This racist's casual cruelty is about to trigger the most spectacular case of instant karma in legal history. Have you ever seen someone's hatred destroy their own life in real time? Earlier that day at 4:17 p.m., Judge Theodore Washington sat in his federal courthouse chambers, reviewing what should have been a routine afternoon. 23 years on the bench had taught him that justice often moved slowly, but today felt different. His secretary knocked and entered without waiting. Judge Washington, Chief Judge Martinez collapsed during lunch. Heart attack. He's stable, but... She placed a thick manila folder on his desk. You need to take over the Sullivan-Chen case. The trial starts at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Theo opened the file, scanning the defendants' names. Officers Jake Sullivan and Marcus Parker, charged with excessive force, civil rights violations, and conspiracy under color of law. The case involved a pattern of racist arrests, planted evidence, and coordinated cover-ups spanning 3 years. Body camera footage showed Sullivan screaming racial slurs while Parker held down a handcuffed teenager. Their victims were always black, always alone, always dismissed by their department. The Justice Department's been watching this precinct for months, his secretary continued. This case could trigger federal oversight of their entire department. Theo studied surveillance photos of the two officers, Sullivan's buzz cut and aggressive stance, Parker's smirking face during booking photos of their victims. Neither man showed any remorse in their depositions. They'd claimed every arrest was justified, every use of force necessary, every complaint unfounded. At 6:30 p.m., Theo's phone rang. His daughter Sarah, crying. Car accident on I-95. Not serious, but she needed him. Her mother was out of town, and Sarah was alone at the hospital, shaken and scared. Theo looked at the case files scattered across his desk, then at the photo of Sarah on his bookshelf. The decision was instant. He could read the files in the car, prepare during the 5-hour drive. Justice would have to wait for a father's love. By 8 p.m., Theo was on the highway carrying documents in his passenger seat, calling his daughter every hour to check on her condition. The radio played softly news about police accountability protests, reform movements gaining momentum, communities demanding change. 200 miles away, at the same rest stop where Theo would soon arrive, Dale Morrison was already 3 beers deep in his pickup truck. His buddy Travis sat beside him, both men complaining about their latest arrests. Morrison for his 4th DUI, Travis for domestic violence. It's these liberal judges, Morrison slurred, crushing another beer can. Letting criminals run wild while decent folks get hassled. He pointed at every black traveler who passed. Look at them, acting like they own the place. In my daddy's day, they knew to stay in their section. Travis nodded, equally drunk. My court date's next month. Some bleeding heart judge probably going to give me community service instead of throwing the book at the wife-beater I beat up. Morrison laughed. These judges don't know real people. They sit in their ivory towers making decisions about folks they never met. Someone should teach them a lesson. At the police station 30 miles away, Officers Sullivan and Parker were ending their shift, grumbling about tomorrow's trial. Parker's phone buzzed with an email marked Urgent, Case Update, but he was too busy complaining to read it thoroughly. Another activist judge, Sullivan said, adjusting his bulletproof vest. Probably gonna lecture us about sensitivity while criminals laugh at us. I heard this new judge is tough, Parker replied, scrolling past the email without opening it. Someone said he's been on the bench forever. Probably another old white guy who thinks he understands the streets. They spent 20 minutes mocking their previous arrestees, imitating the voices of black suspects, joking about accidental injuries during bookings. Their body cameras were off, but the station's internal recording system captured every word. You know what pisses me off most? Sullivan continued. These people act like we're the criminals. We're protecting society from animals, and they want to put us in prison. Chen agreed. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Hope this judge doesn't buy into the racial victimhood narrative. Neither officer bothered reading their emails. Neither realized that fate was about to deliver the ultimate test of their beliefs about justice, respect, and the consequences of unchecked power. At 11:35 p.m., Theo's sedan pulled into the rest stop parking lot. He stepped out, straightening his tie, unaware that Morrison had been watching and waiting. The case files remained visible on his passenger seat, evidence of the irony about to unfold. The stage was set for a collision that would expose not just individual racism, but an entire system's willingness to protect its own until the moment that protection became impossible. At 11:47 p.m., Judge Theodore Washington stepped into the fluorescent-lit nightmare that would change everything. Morrison was waiting, swaying slightly as he blocked Theo's path to the restroom. Well, well. Look what we got here. He circled Theo like a shark sensing blood. Fancy car, fancy clothes. You think you're better than us working folks? Theo tried to step around him. Excuse me, I just need to... I'm talking to you, boy! Morrison shoved Theo hard in the chest, sending him stumbling backward. Don't you walk away when a white man's speaking to you? Travis emerged from the truck, beer in hand, grinning at the confrontation. Dale's right. You got some nerve rolling up here like you own the place. Morrison grabbed Theo's jacket lapel, his face inches away. I bet this car's stolen. I bet you got drugs in there. I bet you're running from something. He twisted the expensive fabric in his fists. What's a criminal like you doing in a suit anyway? Playing dress up? Theo kept his voice calm, professional. Sir, I'm just traveling through. I don't want any trouble. Trouble? Morrison laughed, shoving Theo again. You are the trouble, bringing your kind around decent people. He spit directly at Theo's feet. Get on your knees and empty your pockets. Let's see what you stole. I'm not going to do that. Morrison's expression turned vicious. Oh, you're one of those uppity ones. Think you're equal to us. He pulled out his phone. Well, let's see what the police think about your attitude. Theo watched Morrison dial 911, knowing exactly what was about to happen. 20 years of studying civil rights cases had taught him the script by heart. 911, what's your emergency? Morrison put on his most concerned citizen voice. Yeah, I'm at the Rest Haven truck stop on I-77. There's a suspicious black male here, acting aggressive, probably casing vehicles for theft. He's got a fancy car that doesn't match his demographic, if you know what I mean. I think he might be armed. Theo pulled out his wallet, hoping to defuse the situation. Sir, here's my identification. Morrison slapped the wallet from Theo's hands, sending it skidding across the asphalt face down. Keep your hands where I can see them. He's reaching for something. Send units now. Travis stepped on the wallet, grinding it under his boot. Probably fake ID anyway. They all got fake papers these days. Morrison continued his performance for the 911 operator. Yeah, he's acting real suspicious. Looking in car windows, trying to run when I confronted him. Definitely up to no good. Better send multiple units. This one looks dangerous. Theo bent to retrieve his ID, but Morrison kicked it further away. Don't move! I said, don't move! he shouted into the phone. "He's not complying with the citizen's arrest. This is exactly the kind of criminal behavior we're dealing with." "I'm not under citizen's arrest," Theo said firmly. "You have no legal authority." "Listen to him," Morrison interrupted. "Talking like he knows the law. Probably been through the system before. Send those cops fast." Within 8 minutes, 2 patrol cars arrived with lights flashing. Officers Jake Sullivan and Marcus Parker stepped out, hands already moving toward their weapons as they assessed the scene, a well-dressed black man facing off against 2 white men. Sullivan took charge immediately. "What's the situation here?" Morrison rushed forward, playing the victim perfectly. "Thank God you're here, officers." This man's been acting suspicious, looking in car windows, probably planning thefts. When I tried to be a good citizen and keep an eye on him, he got aggressive and threatening. Chen nodded, never taking his eyes off Theo. "Sir, place your hands on your head and interlace your fingers." "Officers, there's been a misunderstanding," Theo said, keeping his hands visible. "I stopped here to use the restroom. I have identification." "I said hands on your head," Parker barked. "Stop reaching!" Theo complied, watching his constitutional rights evaporate in real time. "I wasn't reaching for anything. My ID is on the ground over there." Sullivan examined the scattered wallet with his flashlight, but the judicial seal was face down, obscured by dirt and Travis's boot print. He saw only expensive leather and credit cards. "Pretty fancy wallet for someone who looks like you," Sullivan sneered. "Where'd you steal it?" "I didn't steal anything. I'm a federal employee." "Federal employee?" Parker laughed. "Right. What are you, a postal worker? Janitor at some government building?" Morrison chimed in again. "Officers, I saw him looking in that Mercedes over there, checking door handles. Definitely criminal behavior." Sullivan walked over to Theo's sedan, peering through the windows. The case files were clearly visible on the passenger seat, but the cover pages faced down, hiding their significance. "Whose car is this?" Sullivan demanded. "It's mine." "The registration is in the glove compartment." "Registration can be faked," Parker said. "Step away from the vehicle." "You're being detained for investigation." "On what grounds?" Theo asked, his legal training kicking in despite the circumstances. "Suspicious activity, possible vehicle theft, interfering with a citizen's investigation," Sullivan rattled off. "And now, you're being uncooperative with the police." Chen moved behind Theo, grabbing his wrists roughly. "You seem to know a lot about legal procedures. Been arrested before?" "I know my constitutional rights," Theo replied calmly. "This detention lacks reasonable suspicion under Terry v. Ohio. You're violating my Fourth Amendment protections." Sullivan and Parker exchanged looks. Most of their usual suspects didn't quote Supreme Court cases. "Listen to this guy," Sullivan mocked. "I think he's a lawyer because he watched some TV shows in prison." Morrison stepped closer, emboldened by police presence. "I told you he was trouble. Probably got warrants. Probably selling drugs. You should search that car thoroughly." Chen tightened the handcuffs deliberately, making them bite into Theo's wrists. "You're being detained pending investigation. You have the right to remain silent, and I suggest you use it." Sullivan began questioning Morrison and Travis, accepting their every word as gospel truth. Their stories grew more elaborate with each telling. Theo had been lurking for hours, had threatened them when confronted, and had definitely been casing multiple vehicles. "Has he made any threats against you?" Sullivan asked. "Absolutely," Morrison lied smoothly. "Said he knew people who could make us disappear. Gang talk, you know how they are." Chen documented the fictional threats in his notepad while Theo stood handcuffed, watching the system he'd devoted his life to serving demonstrate its ugliest face. "Officers," Theo tried once more, "if you'll just look at my identification." "We'll get to that at the station," Sullivan cut him off. "Right now, you're coming with us for questioning." As they loaded him into the patrol car, Theo heard Morrison's final insult. "That's what happens when you forget your place, boy." This is still America. Sullivan slammed the car door, then turned to Parker with satisfaction. "Easy arrest. These types always think they're smarter than they are." Neither officer bothered to properly examine Theo's identification. Neither checked the case files visible in his car. Neither wondered why a supposed criminal spoke with such precise legal terminology and maintained such dignity under pressure. Chen started the engine, completely unaware that he was transporting tomorrow morning's judge to jail. On the radio, dispatch crackled with routine updates about domestic disturbances and traffic stops. "You know what pisses me off about these people," Sullivan said, loud enough for Theo to hear. "They act like victims when they bring this on themselves. Maybe a night in lockup will teach him some respect." In the back seat, hands cuffed behind him, Judge Theodore Washington stared out the window at the passing streetlights. He thought about his daughter waiting at the hospital, about the case files he'd been studying, about the irony of the moment. Most of all, he thought about justice, how it could be delayed, distorted, and denied, but never truly destroyed. Because tomorrow morning, in exactly 9 hours and 13 minutes, Officers Sullivan and Parker were going to learn that justice has a way of finding those who think they're above it. The patrol car disappeared into the night, carrying its precious cargo toward the most spectacular reversal of fortune in legal history. The patrol car's radio chatter filled the silence as Officers Sullivan and Parker transported their prisoner toward downtown booking. In the back seat, Judge Theodore Washington sat with perfect posture despite the handcuffs cutting into his wrists, while his captors discussed their upcoming court appearance with casual ignorance. "Tomorrow's going to be rough," Sullivan said, adjusting his rearview mirror to keep an eye on Theo. "New judge taking over our case at the last minute." Chen groaned. "Great. Just what we need, starting over with some bleeding heart liberal who's going to buy into every sob story." "At least Judge Martinez knew how things really work on the street," Sullivan continued. "This new guy's probably fresh out of law school and thinks he can change the world." Theo listened to them complaining about impressing the new judge while transporting that very judge in handcuffs. The irony was so profound it would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. "You think he'll dismiss the charges?" Parker asked. "Nah, but he'll probably lecture us about police brutality and community relations," Sullivan replied. These academic types love their speeches. At 12:47 a.m., they arrived at the county jail, a concrete fortress that had processed thousands of black men under circumstances eerily similar to tonight's. The booking sergeant, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, barely glanced up from her paperwork. "What did we got?" she asked routinely. "Suspicious person, possible vehicle theft, interfering with investigation," Parker rattled off. "Classic troublemaker who thinks he knows the law." The sergeant typed the charges into her computer while Sullivan uncuffed Theo's hands. "Empty your pockets on the counter. Everything." Theo complied silently, placing his wallet, keys, cell phone, and a small leather notebook on the stainless steel surface. The sergeant inventoried each item without interest, still missing the judicial identification card that remained face down in the wallet. "Expensive stuff for someone in your situation," she commented, examining Theo's Rolex. "Hope you got receipts." "The watch was a gift from my colleagues," Theo said quietly. Sullivan laughed. "Colleagues? What colleagues? Your fellow inmates?" The booking process continued with methodical humiliation. Fingerprints, mugshots, personal questions delivered with barely concealed contempt. Each procedure is designed to strip away dignity, to transform a human being into a case number. "Occupation?" the sergeant asked. "Federal employee," Theo answered. "Be specific." "Janitor? Maintenance? Security guard?" Theo hesitated, knowing the truth would sound like a lie. "Judicial services." Sullivan snorted. "Right, and I'm the Attorney General." They photographed Theo from multiple angles, the camera flash capturing his composed expression. Even in booking photos, his bearing remained dignified, professional qualities that would later make these images incredibly damaging evidence. "Phone call," the sergeant announced, sliding an ancient payphone across the counter. Theo dialed his daughter's number. No answer. She was probably sedated at the hospital. He tried his law clerk's emergency line. Voicemail. Finally, he called his attorney. "Michael, it's Theo. I've been arrested on false charges. I'm being held at county booking. Can you dash?" The line went dead. 30 seconds maximum per call. "Time's up, hotshot," Parker said. "Nobody is coming to bail you out?" "Guess your colleagues aren't as loyal as you thought." They led him to a holding cell containing 6 other men, all black, all arrested on similarly vague charges. The cell reeked of disinfectant and desperation, its concrete walls covered with scratched messages from previous occupants. "What are you in for, brother?" asked a young man who couldn't have been more than 19. "False accusations," Theo replied, settling onto the metal bench. "Ain't we all?" The teenager laughed bitterly. "They got me for loitering with intent." "Intent to do what? Stand outside my own apartment building?" An older man in the corner looked up. "They got me for interfering with police business. My business was asking why they arrested my nephew." For the next hour, Theo listened to story after story, each man a victim of the same systemic harassment he'd been studying in case files. But now he wasn't reading about it in legal briefs. He was living it. The teenager, Marcus, was facing his 3rd arrest in 6 months, all on charges that would later be dismissed for lack of evidence. The older man, Robert, was a deacon whose interference consisted of asking for badge numbers. "You talk differently than most folks they bring in here," Marcus observed. "Are you some kind of lawyer or something?" Theo considered his answer carefully. "I work in the legal system." "Then you know this is all bullshit," Robert said. "They arrest us to fill quotas, make us sit here for hours, then let us go with court dates we can't afford to miss work for." "The process is the punishment," Theo agreed, recognizing the systematic nature of what he was witnessing. Marcus leaned forward, interested. "You really know about law stuff? Because they're trying to say I was selling drugs, but they never found any drugs." For the next 2 hours, Theo found himself providing legal advice to his fellow inmates, explaining search and seizure laws, discussing probable cause, outlining their rights. It felt natural, purposeful even here. Justice needed advocates. Meanwhile, in the booking area, Officer Sullivan was bragging to the night shift about his easy arrest. "City boy thought he was smart, quoting legal cases and acting superior," Sullivan said. "One night in lockup should teach him some humility." Chen nodded, finally pulling out his phone to check messages. He scrolled past several emails, including one marked "Urgent, Case Update," but was too busy celebrating to read carefully. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting," Parker said. "Face to face with this new judge, show him we don't play games with criminals." Neither officer realized they were about to face exactly that, the ultimate test of their attitude toward the law, delivered by the very man they'd just humiliated and caged. In the holding cell, Theo checked the wall clock, 3:17 a.m. In less than 6 hours, he needed to be in federal court, presiding over the case that would now take on entirely new dimensions of meaning. Justice, he reflected, worked in mysterious ways. At 6:15 a.m., Sergeant Patricia Williams arrived for her morning shift, carrying coffee and the weight of 25 years in law enforcement. She'd seen everything, or so she thought until she reviewed the overnight arrest log. "Washington Theodore J.," she read aloud, scanning the booking sheet. The name triggered something in her memory, a nagging familiarity that made her pause mid-sip of coffee. She pulled up the county court system on her computer, cross-referencing the name with active cases. Nothing. Then she tried the federal database, typing Washington Theodore J. into the judicial directory. The screen loaded slowly, then displayed a professional headshot that made Sergeant Williams's blood run cold. Distinguished black man, salt and pepper beard, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The same face from last night's booking photos. The Honorable Theodore J. Washington, United States District Judge, Eastern District. "Holy Mother of God," Williams whispered, her hands shaking as she scrolled through Judge Washington's biography. 23 years on the federal bench, appointed by President Clinton. Confirmed unanimously by the Senate, currently presiding over high-profile civil rights cases. She clicked on the court calendar, desperate to prove her growing suspicion wrong. But there it was, scheduled for 9 a.m. United States v. Sullivan and Parker, excessive force and civil rights violations. Presiding judge, Honorable Theodore J. Washington, the same Sullivan and Parker who had arrested him 6 hours ago. Williams's phone call to Captain Morrison, no relation to Dale Morrison, woke him from deep sleep. "Sir, we have a catastrophic problem. Officers Sullivan and Parker arrested their own judge last night." The silence on the other end stretched so long that Williams wondered if the line had gone dead. "Repeat that," Captain Morrison finally said. "Sullivan and Parker arrested Judge Theodore Washington at 11:47 p.m. He's been holding all night. He's supposed to be on the bench in 3 hours for their trial." Jesus Christ. Papers rustled as the captain searched for the case file. "Are you absolutely certain?" "I'm looking at his federal ID right now. Judge Washington, Eastern District Federal Court. The man who's going to decide whether Sullivan and Parker go to prison." 20 minutes later, Captain Morrison burst through the station doors, followed by Internal Affairs Lieutenant Sarah Collins and Deputy Chief Robert Hayes. The entire command structure had mobilized for damage control. "Where is he?" Captain Morrison demanded. "Still in holding cell 3, Williams reported. "I haven't told him we know who he is." Lieutenant Collins pulled up the arrest report on her tablet. "Christ, look at these charges. Suspicious person? Possible vehicle theft? Based on what evidence? A drunk racist's 911 call and our officer's assumption that a black man in an expensive car must be a criminal," Deputy Chief Hayes said grimly. "This is going to destroy us." They reviewed the body camera footage in horrified silence. Morrison's racist tirade, Sullivan and Parker's immediate assumption of guilt, the casual violence, the deliberate humiliation, the complete disregard for basic civil rights. "They never even looked at his ID properly," Collins observed. "It was right there on the ground." "Because they didn't want to look," Hayes replied. "They saw what they expected to see." Captain Morrison was already calculating the damage. Federal oversight, Justice Department investigation, civil rights lawsuit, congressional hearings. This goes all the way to the top. In holding cell 3, Judge Washington was helping Marcus understand the difference between reasonable suspicion and probable cause when the cell door suddenly opened. Sergeant Williams stood there with 3 senior officers, all looking like they'd seen a ghost. "Mr. Washington," Williams said carefully, "would you please come with us?" The other inmates watched nervously as Theo stood. "Am I being released?" "There's been a development in your case." They led him to an interview room where Captain Morrison sat alone, sweating despite the morning chill. His hands shook as he reviewed Theo's file. "Judge Washington," he began, then stopped, unable to meet Theo's eyes. "Your Honor, we had no idea." Theo sat down slowly, maintaining his composure. "You had no idea about what, Captain?" "About who you are. About your position." Morrison's voice cracked. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding." "Has there?" Theo's voice remained perfectly calm. "Because from my perspective, your officers followed standard procedure. They responded to a call, made assumptions based on my appearance, and arrested me without probable cause." Morrison winced at each word. "The charges are being dropped immediately. All records expunged. You're free to go." "That's very kind of you," Theo said. But I'm curious, if I were actually the car thief your officers believed me to be, would those charges still be dropped? Would those records be expunged? The question hung in the air like a blade. Your Honor, please understand. I understand perfectly, Theo interrupted. I understand that I'm being released not because the arrest was wrong, but because you've discovered it was inconvenient. Morrison tried desperately to salvage the situation. We're prepared to offer a full apology, complete cooperation with any investigation, disciplinary action for the officers involved. Theo stood, straightening his rumpled suit. Captain, in approximately 2.5 hours, I'll be sitting on the federal bench, presiding over a case involving Officers Sullivan and Parker. A case about their pattern of racially motivated arrests and excessive force. The blood drained from Morrison's face. Your Honor, surely you'll recuse yourself given the conflict of interest. Theo smiled for the first time since his arrest. Conflict of interest? Captain, I'd say I now have a very clear understanding of how your officers operate, perhaps clearer than any judge has ever had. Morrison stood up desperately. Judge Washington, please. These men have families, careers. This was just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. Theo's voice cut like ice. Captain, your officers spent 6 hours believing I was a criminal based solely on my race. They humiliated me, violated my rights, and celebrated doing it. The only misunderstanding was thinking they could continue this behavior without consequences. He moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Captain? You might want to review your officers' training records. In 2 hours and 43 minutes, every word of last night's encounter will be entered into federal evidence. Every racist comment, every violation of procedure, every moment of casual cruelty. Morrison slumped back in his chair as Theo left the room. Through the window, he could see Sullivan and Parker arriving for their shift, laughing about something, completely unaware that their careers, and possibly their freedom, had ended at 11:47 p.m. the previous night. Lieutenant Collins knocked and entered. Sir, what do we do? Morrison stared at the empty doorway where Judge Washington had been. Pray, he said quietly. Pray that the federal prison has room for 2 more dirty cops. In the parking lot, Theo retrieved his case files from his sedan and checked his watch. 7:23 a.m. Enough time to go home, shower, put on fresh robes, and return for the most important trial of his career. A trial where he would no longer need to imagine what his defendant's victims had experienced. He had lived it. At 8:45 a.m., Judge Theodore Washington emerged from his chambers wearing fresh robes and carrying the weight of a sleepless night that had fundamentally changed his perspective on justice. The federal courthouse buzzed with its usual morning energy lawyers shuffling papers, court reporters testing equipment, bailiffs preparing for another day of dispensing justice. Theo reviewed his reflection in the chamber mirror one final time. The handcuff marks on his wrists had faded but not disappeared. His dignity remained intact, but his understanding of the system he served had been forever altered. At 8:52 a.m., Officers Jake Sullivan and Marcus Parker walked through the courthouse security checkpoint, their polished badges catching the morning light. They carried themselves with the casual arrogance of men who believed themselves untouchable, joking with the court security officers about another day of liberal lecture therapy. Think this new judge will be reasonable? Parker asked, adjusting his dress uniform. They're all the same, Sullivan replied. Academic types who've never walked a beat, never faced real criminals. He'll probably want to discuss our cultural sensitivity and community relations. They settled into the defendant's table, their attorney public defender Michael Harrison spreading case files between them. Harrison looked nervous, constantly checking his watch and scanning the courtroom entrance. Something wrong, counselor? Sullivan asked. Harrison wiped sweat from his forehead. I received some unusual communications this morning. Federal oversight investigators, internal affairs, even the Justice Department. Everyone wants to be present for this hearing. Chen shrugged. Good. Let them see how we really handle crime in this city. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff's voice rang through the courtroom. All rise. The Honorable Theodore J. Washington presiding. The courtroom door opened, and Sullivan and Parker looked up to see their judge for the first time. Both men froze. Sullivan's mouth fell open. Parker dropped his pen, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent courtroom. Walking toward the bench with measured dignity was the same black man they had handcuffed, humiliated, and caged 7 hours earlier. "Oh my God," Parker whispered, his face draining of color. Sullivan gripped the table edge so hard his knuckles went white. That's... The man you arrested last night," Harrison finished, having pieced together the morning's frantic phone calls. "Judge Theodore Washington, Eastern District Federal Court." Theo took his seat on the bench, his movements deliberate and controlled. He surveyed the courtroom, the packed gallery of federal investigators, civil rights attorneys, reporters who'd somehow learned of overnight developments, and his own court staff who looked at him with new understanding. "Good morning," Theo said, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades on the bench. "Before we proceed with today's hearing, the court must address a significant development that occurred last evening." Sullivan and Parker sat frozen, watching their careers evaporate in real time. "At approximately 11:47 p.m. yesterday, I was unlawfully detained, arrested, and imprisoned by the defendants in this case, Officers Sullivan and Parker, based on false accusations and racial profiling." The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispered conversations. Harrison buried his face in his hands while his clients stared in horror. Theo continued with judicial calm. "This incident has created what might appear to be a conflict of interest. However, after careful consideration and consultation with judicial ethics guidelines, I have determined that this experience provides me with invaluable first-hand knowledge of the defendant's character and methods." Federal Prosecutor Jennifer Martinez stood. "Your Honor, the government requests that last night's incident be entered as additional evidence of the defendant's pattern of discriminatory enforcement." "So ordered," Theo replied. Theo. "Bailiff, please activate the courtroom recording system." For the next hour, the court heard evidence that took on devastating new meaning. Body camera footage from previous arrests showed Sullivan and Parker using identical tactics, racial profiling, false accusations, coordinated lies, deliberate humiliation of black citizens. But now, the judge wasn't just reviewing case files. He had experienced their methods personally. "Mr. Sullivan," Theo said, addressing the officer directly, "in your deposition, you stated that you always follow proper procedure when detaining suspects. Can you explain why proper procedure includes accepting the unsubstantiated word of an intoxicated racist over the calm denials of the accused?" Sullivan's attorney objected, but Theo overruled. "The defendant will answer." Sullivan stammered, "Your Honor, we had to respond to the citizen's complaint." "The citizen who called me boy and demanded I get on my knees? That citizen?" The courtroom was dead silent. Sullivan had no answer. Theo turned to Parker. "Officer Parker, you documented in your report that I made gang threats against the complainants. Can you specify what these alleged threats were?" Chen's face was ashen. The complainant reported, "Officer Parker, I was present during this entire encounter. I made no threats of any kind. Are you testifying under oath that you documented threats that never occurred?" Harrison finally found his voice. "Your Honor, I must object to this line of questioning. My clients—" "Your clients," Theo interrupted, "spent 6 hours believing they had arrested a car thief. They celebrated their easy arrest. They made racist jokes about my expensive wallet and fancy talk. They questioned my right to own a luxury vehicle based solely on my race." He paused, letting the words sink in. All of this was recorded on station security cameras and their own body cameras. All of it demonstrates the exact pattern of behavior alleged in the original civil rights charges. At 10:30 a.m., FBI agents entered the courtroom with federal warrants. Special Agent Rebecca Foster approached the bench. Your Honor, based on last night's incident and this morning's revelations, the Justice Department is initiating a comprehensive investigation of the entire police department under Section 14,441 of the Civil Rights Act. Captain Morrison, who had been sitting in the gallery, visibly slumped. Federal oversight meant the end of departmental autonomy, the end of protecting problematic officers, the end of business as usual. Theo addressed the packed courtroom. This case began as a civil rights violation. It has now become something far more significant, a window into how systemic racism operates at every level of law enforcement. He gestured toward Sullivan and Parker, who sat in stunned silence. These officers didn't see a federal judge when they arrested me. They saw what they always see when they look at black citizens, a criminal to be controlled, humiliated, and processed through their system of biased justice. The afternoon session brought a parade of additional victims, people who had experienced identical treatment but lacked the power and position to seek justice. Marcus Williams, the teenager from the holding cell, testified about 3 arrests in 6 months, all dismissed for lack of evidence. Robert Johnson, the deacon, described being handcuffed for interference when he asked about his nephew's arrest. Each testimony followed the same pattern Sullivan and Parker had used on Judge Washington: racial profiling, false accusations, excessive force, coordinated lies. By 3 p.m., Internal Affairs Lieutenant Sarah Collins was detailing the department's history of covering up complaints against both officers. 17 citizen complaints in 3 years, 14 involving racial bias, all dismissed without investigation. Lieutenant Collins, Theo asked, in your professional opinion, does last night's incident represent an anomaly in the defendant's behavior? No, Your Honor. It represents the natural culmination of a pattern we've been ignoring for years. The courtroom watched Sullivan and Parker slowly realize that their careers, their freedom, and their futures were disappearing. Sullivan began crying silently. Parker stared at his hands, occasionally glancing at the judge he had humiliated just hours earlier. At 4:15 p.m., the Justice Department announced federal charges beyond the original civil rights violations conspiracy under color of law, deprivation of rights, obstruction of justice, and filing false police reports. Harrison requested a recess to discuss plea negotiations. The federal prosecutors weren't interested. "Mr. Harrison," Prosecutor Martinez said loud enough for the gallery to hear, "your clients arrested a federal judge based on racial prejudice, then spent hours celebrating their accomplishment. There will be no plea negotiations." As the afternoon concluded, Theo addressed the defendants directly. Officers Sullivan and Parker, you have spent your careers believing that badges make you untouchable, that victims of your bias have no voice, no power, no recourse. Last night, you learned differently. Both men looked up at him with desperate eyes. But this case was never about me. It was about every Marcus Williams, every Robert Johnson, every citizen you've targeted because of their race. I was simply privileged enough to experience what they experience regularly and powerful enough to ensure consequences follow. Sullivan finally spoke, his voice barely audible. Your Honor, we didn't know. Theo's response was swift and sharp. Officer Sullivan, you didn't know because you didn't want to know. You saw a black man and assumed criminality. You heard racist accusations and assumed validity. You witnessed dignity under pressure and assumed guilt. He leaned forward slightly. The fact that I happen to be a federal judge doesn't make your actions worse. It simply makes the consequences unavoidable. As court adjourned, federal marshals approached Sullivan and Parker with arrest warrants. Their badges were confiscated, their weapons secured, their careers officially ended. In the gallery, Captain Morrison watched his officers being led away in handcuffs, a poetic justice that would be replayed on news stations nationwide. Judge Washington gathered his files, the same case materials he'd been studying when this nightmare began. Tomorrow would bring sentencing hearings, departmental reforms, and a federal consent decree that would transform policing in their jurisdiction. But tonight, he would finally drive home to his daughter, carrying with him a deeper understanding of the justice system's failures and an unshakable commitment to ensuring those failures had consequences. The system had tried to break him at 11:47 p.m. By 5 p.m., he had broken it back. 3 months later, the same federal courthouse that had witnessed Judge Washington's revelation now served as the stage for Justice's final act. The media circus outside rivaled a presidential visit. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and local stations from 6 states broadcasting live as the nation watched 2 corrupt officers face the consequences of their racism. Inside Courtroom 4A, Judge Washington presided over the sentencing hearing with the same measured dignity he'd maintained through months of testimony, federal investigations, and death threats from white supremacist groups who viewed him as a symbol of their worst fears. Officers Sullivan and Parker sat at the defendant's table in orange jumpsuits, their transformation from swaggering cops to broken convicts complete. Sullivan had aged a decade in 3 months. Parker stared at his shackled hands, occasionally glancing at the packed gallery where his wife sat crying. "The defendants will rise," Judge Washington commanded. Both men stood unsteadily, their public defender flanking them like a priest administering last rites. Theo reviewed the sentencing guidelines, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "Officers Sullivan and Parker, a federal jury has found you guilty of conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, deprivation of constitutional rights, obstruction of justice, and filing false police reports." The courtroom was silent except for the clicking of cameras and the scratch of reporters' pens. The evidence presented during this trial revealed not an isolated incident, but a systematic campaign of racial terrorism conducted under the protection of police badges. 17 documented victims, hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees for innocent citizens, immeasurable damage to community trust in law enforcement. Sullivan's legs buckled slightly. Parker's wife sobbed audibly. "Your actions on the night of my arrest were not aberrant. They were typical. You saw a black citizen exercising his constitutional right to travel freely, and you decided he needed to be controlled, humiliated, and caged." Theo's voice grew stronger, carrying decades of judicial experience and the personal weight of having endured their racism firsthand. "The court sentences Jake Sullivan to 7 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Marcus Parker, you are sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years supervised release. Both defendants are permanently barred from law enforcement employment and will register as civil rights violators." The sentences exceeded what most observers expected. Federal guidelines suggested 3 to 5 years, but Judge Washington's enhancement factors targeting a federal official, pattern of abuse, obstruction of justice, justified the harsh punishment. Furthermore, Theo continued, the court orders restitution payments totaling $2.3 million to be distributed among your documented victims. Sullivan collapsed into his chair. His police pension, his house, his children's college funds, everything would go toward compensating the people he'd terrorized. Dale Morrison, the racist who had triggered the entire sequence, received his own judgment 2 hours later in state court. Federal hate crime charges carried a 3-year sentence, plus lifetime probation requiring anger management counseling and community service specifically focused on racial reconciliation. As Morrison was led away in chains, he finally understood that his casual racism had destroyed not just his own life, but the careers of 2 police officers and exposed systemic corruption in an entire department. The afternoon brought the announcement everyone had been waiting for: the federal consent decree governing the police department's complete restructuring. Deputy Chief Hayes, now serving as interim chief after Captain Morrison's resignation, signed the 247-page agreement that would govern police operations for the next 5 years. Federal monitors would oversee hiring, training, disciplinary procedures, and community relations. Body cameras would be mandatory and always activated. Racial bias training would be conducted quarterly. Complaint investigations would be handled by an independent civilian review board. This consent decree represents the most comprehensive police reform in modern American history, announced Justice Department Civil Rights Division Chief Rebecca Martinez. Judge Washington's experience exposed systemic failures that demanded systematic solutions. The financial impact was staggering. The department's $50 million annual budget would increase by 30% to fund reforms. Federal oversight would cost an additional $15 million yearly. Insurance premiums skyrocketed as the city became a high-risk liability. But the human impact was more profound. Marcus Williams, the teenager from the holding cell, had been accepted to law school with a full scholarship funded by civil rights organizations inspired by the case. Robert Johnson was appointed to the new Civilian Review Board. 17 other victims received substantial settlements and public apologies. At 4:47 p.m., exactly 5 hours after his arrest 90 days earlier, Judge Washington concluded the most significant case of his career. "Justice delayed is justice denied," he said, addressing the packed courtroom. "But justice served, even belatedly, creates ripples that transform entire communities." As he struck his gavel for the final time, federal marshals began the process of transporting Sullivan and Parker to different maximum security prisons, separated to prevent them from coordinating their stories or plotting revenge. The system that had protected them for years was now ensuring they would never harm another citizen. Judge Washington removed his robes in chambers, exhausted but satisfied. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, Sarah. "Dad, I watched the sentencing on TV. I'm proud of you." Outside, protesters from both sides lined the courthouse steps. Civil rights advocates celebrated with chants of "Justice served," while a smaller group of police supporters held signs reading "Blue Lives Matter." But inside the courthouse, justice wasn't about sides or politics or protest signs. It was about two racist cops spending the next 6 to 7 years learning that badges don't make anyone untouchable, and that karma, when it finally arrives, collects with interest. 1 year later, Judge Theodore Washington pulled his sedan into the same Rest Haven truck stop where his nightmare had begun. The fluorescent lights cast the same harsh glare, but everything else had changed. New management signs proclaimed "All travelers welcome" in English and Spanish. Diversity training certificates hung prominently near the entrance. The same restroom where Theo had tried to escape Dale Morrison's harassment now featured accessibility improvements and security cameras changes mandated after the federal civil rights lawsuit that had cost the previous owners $4.2 million. Theo stepped out of his car, straightening the same tie he'd worn that terrible night. A young black family was using the picnic tables nearby, their children playing freely while their parents relaxed without fear. An elderly white couple nodded respectfully as they passed him, their simple courtesy a stark contrast to the hatred he'd experienced here. The gas station attendant, a college-aged Latina woman, smiled warmly. "Can I help you with anything, sir?" "Just stretching my legs, thank you." She paused, studying his face. "Excuse me, but are you Judge Washington, the one from the news?" Theo nodded, bracing for whatever reaction might follow. "My professor showed us your case in constitutional law class. What you did, it changed everything for people like my family." 3 months earlier, Theo had received the NAACP's highest honor for judicial courage at a ceremony attended by Supreme Court justices, civil rights leaders, and hundreds of young law students. His acceptance speech had been simple. Justice requires no special courage, only the refusal to accept injustice as normal. The statistics spoke for themselves. Police complaints in their jurisdiction had dropped 67% since the consent decree took effect. use of force incidents involving racial minorities had decreased by 78%. Community trust in law enforcement, measured by anonymous surveys, had risen from 23% to 61% among Black residents. Sullivan and Parker were serving their sentences in separate federal prisons, their appeals exhausted, their law enforcement careers permanently ended. Prison records showed Sullivan had been hospitalized twice after confrontations with inmates who recognized him from news coverage. Parker had requested protective custody after receiving death threats from both white supremacists who viewed him as a traitor and minorities who remembered his victims. Dale Morrison had completed his first year of court-ordered community service, working at a homeless shelter in a predominantly Black neighborhood. His mandatory racial sensitivity counseling had opened his eyes to the humanity he'd spent decades denying, though his transformation came too late to undo the damage he'd caused. The ripple effects continued spreading. 17 other police departments had implemented similar reforms after facing Justice Department investigations. Law schools now taught Washington versus Sullivan as a landmark case in civil rights enforcement. 3 documentaries and 2 books had chronicled the case, ensuring its lessons would endure. But the most meaningful change was personal. Marcus Williams, the teenager from the holding cell, had graduated from Howard University Law School with honors and been hired as a federal prosecutor specializing in civil rights cases. His first conviction, another police excessive force case, had been secured using precedents established in Judge Washington's courtroom. As Theo prepared to leave the rest stop, his phone rang. Sarah, now a sophomore at Georgetown, was calling with news about her acceptance to a summer internship with the Civil Rights Division. "Dad, I want to do what you do. Fight for justice." Theo smiled, looking around at the transformed truck stop one final time. "Justice isn't something you fight for, sweetheart. It's something you create, one case at a time, one decision at a time, one moment of courage at a time." He drove home that evening thinking about the young law students who would carry these lessons forward, the police officers who would think twice before letting prejudice guide their actions, and the citizens who now knew that even the most powerful systems could be held accountable. Justice had prevailed not through vengeance or anger, but through the simple insistence that all people, regardless of race, status, or position, deserved equal treatment under law. The system had tried to break Judge Theodore Washington at 11:47 p.m. on a dark highway rest stop. Instead, he had used that moment to rebuild it stronger, fairer, and more just. What would you do if you witnessed discrimination like this? Would you speak up, record evidence, or stand by silently? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because change happens when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice as normal. If this story moved you, like this video to support more content exposing systemic racism and celebrating those who fight it. Subscribe to Black Soul Stories and join our community of people who believe equal justice under law isn't just a motto, it's a promise worth keeping. Ring the notification bell, because every week we share stories of courage, accountability, and hope that prove even the most entrenched systems can change when good people demand better. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice serves to create ripples that transform the world.